April 9th, 2014, AMD released a new CPU socket called AM1. AM1 is a rather weird socket name, since socket AM2 released in 2006, a whole 8 years before socket AM1 did. Back when socket AM1 came out, it was known to be a pretty good option to get a 4-core CPU on the cheap, like this AMD Sempron 3850, which knew it costed right around 35 to 40 United States dollars. There are only 7 CPUs on socket AM1. All of the CPUs have a 25 watt TDP. Also, all of the AM1 CPUs but one have 4 cores. Today I will be reviewing the lowest end 4-core CPU that is on socket AM1, which is an AMD Sempron 3850. It has a whole 4 cores and no hyperthreading, clocked at a whopping 1.3 GHz with no turbo. 1.3 GHz is all you get, no more. And also, this AMD Sempron is somewhat special in a way. The reason for that is, this is the last ever released CPU under the Sempron name. And this is also the first AMD Sempron and the last AMD Sempron to have 4 cores. So paired with this Sempron 3850, I have 16GB of DDR3 running at 1600 MHz, or should be at least. In Task Manager it is showing at 667 MHz though, which is DDR2 speed, so I am not sure what's up with that. And I'm also pairing this with a Nvidia RTX 3060 graphics card, so the CPU doesn't get limited from the iGPU on the CPU. The boot drive is a 128GB inland SSD, the game drive is a 2TB Samsung 870 EVO. Without further ado, let's get into the benchmarks. To do some updates on some games, it wasn't that bad. Yes, it was a little bit sluggish, but that's mostly due to the USB. I was stuck to USB 2.0 as there are no USB 3.0 headers on this motherboard, and I couldn't go and use my USB 3.0 card as there's only one PCI slot on the motherboard, which the graphics card is taking up. So when it comes to web browsing, this Sempron is quite weird. So it is sluggish, but not sluggish at the exact same time. So to load a website, it takes about 30 seconds. So not that good, but not that bad either, as it does get the job done. But the weird thing is, it doesn't become unresponsive. For example, you could go over and click on a website to open it up, like for example youtube.com, and it will load it. It'll take about 30 seconds, but you can also go over and, for example, open up Discord and talk in Discord while it opens, and it's not unresponsive, unlike, for example, my dual-core CPU, which is the Athlon X2 5600 Plus, where it would go over and lag other apps as well in the process. Instead, this does everything slower, but it doesn't freeze at all, at least from my experience using it. Though I do notice that the mouse does lag a little bit, like it goes over and just stutters, which is kind of weird. I've not really seen a problem like that on any CPU in the past where moving the mouse around it will sometimes lag. Yeah, that is a little bit weird. I do find it somewhat fascinating though. But I have used this CPU for web browsing for a bit over 100 hours at this point. I've been using it for over 1 month straight as my main web browsing CPU, and I've also used it to capture some footage for some videos, and all in all, it does a pretty decent job at that. I also need to add, if you're using the iGPU, it will be slower than what you see here in the video. That is where I get the 30 seconds to load a website figure. Also, when it comes to watching YouTube with the iGPU, you're pretty much limited to 720p 60fps or 1080p 30fps. 1080p 60fps is a little bit too much and it does lag. The first game up on the list is Apex Legends, and I am playing at 1080p on the low settings. And this is a very interesting experience. So, I was expecting it to be stuttering like crazy, but it isn't. It's not really stuttering at all. Instead, it's just basically a constant stutter, or basically you're just getting around 20 FPS. Though it is smooth, but still it's only around 20. To be fair, 20 is being pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't even know. Pretty generous, I guess, because it didn't really hit 20 FPS all that much. Most of the time it was below 20. So would I consider it playable? Well, in this case, if you're not competitive and you don't get headaches from low FPS, I would say yeah, it's decent enough, I guess, to just run around and have a little bit of fun. But if you're trying to be at least somewhat competitive, or you don't like 20 frames per second, this is absolutely unplayable. The next game up on the list is BeamNG Drive. Now, I expected this to run a little bit better, but it didn't. So, the game got an average frame rate of 12, and a 1% low of 9 frames per second. So, not stuttery, okay, there's that, but at the same time though, 12 frames per second on average is very not good, especially for low settings. And off camera, I also tried to play on the grid map, and it didn't really help the frame rate at all as well. It was still getting in the ballpark of 12. Borderlands 3 at 1080p on the low settings was also not a very good experience. It was getting roughly 10 frames per second. Ignore the average frame rate figure as well as the 1% low, as I did not go over and reset them, so they are inaccurate. But if you look at the current FPS, it's hovering around 10, so not very good. It was stuttering quite a bit, and all in all, a quite bad experience. The next game up on the list is Brawlhalla. Now, Brawlhalla is at 1080p, and I have no idea what settings it's at, or what you want to call it, I guess. The reason why is Brawlhalla doesn't really have any video settings. The only video setting there is to change the resolution. So, on Brawlhalla, the game ran just fine. It got, well, I don't know the exact frame rate figure, as I cannot get MSI Afterburner to work in the game, but it felt roughly like 60. I'm sure it did drop below 60 at times, but all in all, it was a very, very playable experience, and the best running game so far, by far. Call of Duty Warzone 2.0 ran horribly, so I was playing the game at 1080p on the lowest settings, and I cannot show you the lowest settings on screen because I cannot seem to find where I was showing it in the video. The reason why is there is over 4 hours of Call of Duty Warzone 2.0 footage, which most of it was just sitting in the menu waiting for shaders to optimize. Yes, it took about 4 hours to optimize shaders. Either way, in the game was getting around 7 frames per second, which is completely and utterly unplayable. So, all in all, I would say don't even bother downloading Call of Duty Warzone 2.0 if you're on a Sempron. Just don't. You can if you want, no one's stopping you, but if you want anything to be remotely playable, this is not the game. Nope, definitely not. The next game up on the list is CSGO, and it ran pretty interesting. So I was playing at 1080p on the very low settings, and the game ran at between 20 and 30 frames per second, sometimes going above 30 frames per second and sometimes going below 20. Sometimes going into the single digits as well. So all in all, it is not a very good experience, but compared to Call of Duty Warzone, it is a flawless experience. But in reality though, it still is not very good at all. But I did end up getting quite a few kills in the matches I played, and it was a pretty nice time playing. Granted, it still is not a very good experience. Cyberpunk 2077 also is completely unplayable. The reason why is the game quote-unquote flatlined before I could even get to the main menu. Flatlined basically means it crashed, or it doesn't want to open. So that makes this game completely unplayable. I can't speak. Dota 2 at 1080p on the low settings, or the settings made for best performance, ran at between 25 and 30 frames per second, sometimes dipping below that and sometimes going above that, but 25 to 30 frames per second is where it hovered. And it wasn't necessarily a bad experience, but it wasn't necessarily a great experience either. It ran, and you could probably have some pretty good fun, but all in all, yeah, I can't complain too much about it. The game doesn't really require that high frame rate at all, and if I was into Dota 2, I'd have a pretty nice time playing. The next game up on the list is Fall Guys, and Fall Guys at 1080p on the lowest settings with full resolution texture detail. The game was getting between 20 and 30 frames per second, mostly hovering around 20. So it did sometimes drop below that, and of course go above 30 as well. but all in all, it was a pretty slow experience. But at the exact same time, the game doesn't really require that many frames per second anyway to be playable. So I would say this is a pretty playable experience. It's not perfect by any means, it's far from it. But if you want to play some Fall Guys, I'd say this CPU can do it. Fortnite at 1080p on the lowest settings on DirectX 11 ran like this. I will let you choose if this is playable or not. And no, I am not pausing the video, this is actually how it's running. Yeah, I would say this is a very playable experience, and I would recommend this to literally anyone. Even, what's his name again? I forgot. Ninja? Is that what he's called on Twitch or whatever? The epic Fortnite player of some sort? I think so, right? And if you can't tell, I am kidding. This is completely, utterly unplayable. And yes, I am also testing performance mode, and performance mode didn't perform much more than bad. Yeah, it was getting a little bit better frame rate, but it still had very big stutters, and overall it was still a very bad experience. The next game is GTA V, and on GTA V, or GTA 5, I had a pretty nice time. In fact, I completely forgot I was even benchmarking the game. Either way, in the game, it wasn't a very good experience, but it wasn't really that stuttery either. It was getting around 25 frames per second, often dropping below 25, and sometimes, quite rarely, going above 25. So all in all, I'd say it's a mediumly okay experience, because it wasn't really that stuttery, so there's that going for it. But at the same time, I can't really recommend it either, as it was below 30 frames per second. But at the same time, I could play like that all day long in this game and just be fine. I also need to add in that when I first started the game and I drove through the town, like the big city in the game, the textures did fail to load and took a little while for them to all load in, like you saw at the beginning of the clip. It was just sort of like a void, just everything disappeared. But that was the only instance I had of all of that disappearing, and I played the game for about 40 minutes. So, not great still, but hey, at least it fixed itself after about 1 or 2 minutes. The next game up on the list is a Minecraft Java Edition on 1.19 using Sodium and Phosphor, which are two different mods for the game, which help enhance the performance a little bit. Either way, the game ran at roughly 60 frames per second with 4 chunks render distance on a brand new world. Don't get me wrong, 60 frames per second is not very good, for Minecraft at least, but I mean, at the same time, it is completely utterly playable. When I say it's not good, I just mean a lot of other CPUs can sometimes get 1000 plus FPS on the exact same settings. But I had a pretty decent time playing. When I say that, I got distracted and played the game for about 2 hours straight, and then after I was done recording, I played it for another 6 hours. Yeah, that's when you know it's at least a little bit decent, when you keep getting distracted and keep playing. Either way, it was alright at 4 chunks render distance. It did stutter a little bit when you loaded up new chunks. When I say a little bit, I do mean it froze at times. And if you loaded up pre-loaded chunks before, what I mean by that is if you explored an area and just walked back into the area you already explored, the stutters weren't as bad, but it still wasn't great by any means. And at 6 chunks render distance, it ran a little bit worse. It was getting about 50 frames per second, and the stutters were a little bit bigger. And 8 chunks render distance, the same could be said about 6 chunks render distance. It was still getting more and more stuttery the higher the render distance was. So I'd say a good middle would be about 5 to 6 chunks render distance, because it did run pretty decently. Then I tried out how the game ran on my Let's Play world. Now, my Let's Play world is hosted on a server, and it is not a very good representation of how Minecraft will normally run for people, because most people start a new world every month or two. My world is currently 4 years old. It was created in 1.13. and it's gotten about 30,000 days worth of server runtime, and about 2,500 days of playtime on it, which is a rather big amount. And I have a lot of redstone all over the place that hurt the performance as well, and my world gets about half the frame rate of a normal empty world. So on 4 chunks render distance, the Sempron was getting roughly 30 frames per second, sometimes dipping below 30 and sometimes going above 30. Not very good, but it was playable. And yes, I did play the game for 6 hours at this frame rate on my world, so I don't know what to say about that besides, yeah, that's a thing. The next game on the list is Portal. No, don't mistake it with Portal RTX. They're 2 different games when it comes to performance. Portal RTX doesn't even run on my i7 3770K computer with a Nvidia RTX 3060. I mean, it runs, but it runs very poorly. But I'm playing the old version of the game, which is Portal. The gameplay is exactly the same, just the graphics are not quite as fancy as Portal RTX. Either way, on normal Portal, on the high settings, the Sempron managed to pull a very smooth and not stuttery at all 60 FPS, which I am actually shocked about. I was expecting this to get around 30 frames per second. So all in all, I do highly recommend you to get Portal if you have this CPU, because it will run flawlessly. Like, absolutely fine. I am still shocked that it ran so good. The next game up on the list is Roblox Arsenal at 1080p on the lowest settings with a FPS unlocker. Either way, the game got 15 to 20 frames per second, which is pretty underwhelming. I was expecting this to get around 40 to 50 frames per second, but nope, it didn't even get close. But to be fair, it wasn't stuttering that badly, so I have to give it credit in that situation, because other CPUs I've tested in the past stuttered like crazy in this game, and this wasn't all that bad. Now, this is one of the more intensive Roblox games out there, so if you wanted, you could look around for some other Roblox games that might not be quite as intensive, and they should run significantly better. The next game up on the list is Rocket League at 1080p on the performance settings, or basically the low preset. Either way, the game ran at around 40 frames per second, sometimes dropping into the 30s, sometimes dropping below 30, and sometimes going above 50. It just really depended how it felt, I guess. But it wasn't a bad experience. It was pretty playable, not a very great experience by any means. It's like pretty much every game we've played so far, but by no means it was unplayable. The next game up on the list is Team Fortress 2. Team Fortress 2 ran pretty interestingly. So inside of the building, it got around 40 frames per second, which is pretty decent, but as soon as you stepped outside, it was in the 20s. So outside, the performance wasn't very good, and inside, it was decent. Is it playable? I don't know. I don't know much about this game, and I can't really play it either way. What I mean by that is I immediately die. Immediately, I mean. Immediately? I don't know what to say. Basically, I lose immediately. I lose right away. But it does run, so there's that. The next game up on the list, or I should say benchmark in this case, is Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p on the low preset. So, the benchmark got an average frame rate of 18. I wasn't there to watch how it performed though, because it might have been stuttering. The reason why I wasn't there is because I was out away from the house for a few hours. Either way, 18 frames per second is definitely not very good, but it might be playable. I'm not sure though, to be fair, because, again, I wasn't there to watch it. And I also don't know what kind of reactions this game requires, and really that much about it, to be fair. I've not played this game more than just playing through the benchmark. And also in CPU-Z, the Sempron got a single thread score of 81.6 and a multi-thread score of 321.2. On Cinebench R23, the Sempron got a multi-core score of 576. And a single core score of 155, and a MP ratio of 3.73. I should also add, for CPU-Z and Cinebench R23, both benchmarks were in the high priority in Task Manager. So now it is conclusion time. Do I recommend you to go out and buy a AM1 motherboard, then go out and buy a AM1 CPU for your next computer build? Well, it really depends. Again, if you're an enthusiast and you just want to muck around with it, then sure. And for literally anyone else, no. Don't build an AM1 computer, as the parts for it are overpriced. Just to buy the cheapest AM1 motherboard on eBay, you are looking to pay $35, and to buy this Sempron 3850, you are looking at another $40. It is cheaper to go with the CPU without the CPU cooler, but to buy the cooler by itself, it costs more than the savings to go with the CPU without the CPU cooler. So right there, you're looking at $75 for just the bare bones of the computer, and yet you are getting slower performance than a Intel Core 2 Quad, which was released in 2006. I recommend looking for a cheap Intel LGA 1366 motherboard, and looking for something like a Intel Xeon E5645, which has 6 cores and 12 threads, and is significantly faster than this Sempron. Those CPUs are going for about $5 on eBay, and about $25 to $30 for the motherboard, and it will be a ton faster than this Sempron. I also quickly need to mention how editing has been on the CPU, because I have edited this entire video on the CPU. So there was 12 hours of footage, and to import all 12 hours of footage, it took roughly 36 hours, which is absurdly, insanely long. One of the longest import times I've ever had to deal with. To add to that, editing has been sluggish. It's been fine, I've got this entire video edited, but it's definitely been sluggish, and I'm somewhat happy I'm pretty much done editing this video. But one way or another, I don't recommend this CPU, or motherboard, or entire socket. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.